Welcome back to the Explainers. So today we are exploring a text that is just absolutely mind-bending. We're looking at the unfinished Encyclopedia of Jorge Luis Borges, which is essentially this giant labyrinth made entirely of paper. But here is the central paradox, right? The thing that makes this text so incredibly fascinating. It's a book that literally preemptively roasts itself. It contains this whole apparatus built inside it just to undermine its own existence. It acts as its own negative review. So you kind of have to wonder, how do you even begin to comprehend a text that tells you from page 1, hey, don't trust me? Well, let's find out together.
Seriously, what actually happens when you write a book that desperately tries to prove it doesn't exist? Well, the authors tackle this right out of the gate with this 4-page prefatory note. Now, normally a preface sets the stage, right? Gives you some context. Yeah, not this one. This note deliberately disarms you. It warns the reader that the book has no proper order whatsoever. It says the temporality is totally ambiguous. It even throws out the idea that the supposed author, Borges himself, might not have even written it. By the end of those 4 pages, literally every expectation you had has been completely dismantled. You're basically told to proceed with caution, but also delight. Caution because, well, philosophical traps, and delight for the sheer wordplay. Okay, let's dive into this. Exhibit A, the ultimate literary forgery. Because this text isn't just a normal book. It is operating like this high-stakes, slightly ridiculous literary heist. It's posing as an encyclopedia, sure, but it is constantly stealing its own credibility. The opening text just straight up says, let us begin, or continue, or conclude. The distinction does not matter. Think about that. The authors wrote 4 pages essentially just to say, here's a book, good luck, and somehow made it sound incredibly profound. It just brilliantly sets up these deep, deep philosophical traps right from the jump. You literally haven't even made it to the first official entry yet, and already time, structure, and the very concept of a beginning have been rendered completely meaningless.
Moving on to Exhibit B, weaponized recursion.
So from that totally dizzying start, we transition into the actual labyrinthine contents of the encyclopedia itself. And guys, this is where things get truly wild. The authors start weaponizing this infinite regress to just trap the reader. Like in a normal encyclopedia, cross-references are helpful, right? They guide you. Here, they are literal traps. The entry for the Aleph tells you to go see the Zahir. The Aztec lottery points you over to the company. The Infinite Encyclopedia says you should read about Cantor, George, madness of. But here is the absolute punchline. None of those cross-referenced entries actually exist in the book. Not a single one. Every single reference points into an absolute void. As one critic pointed out, this is either this devastating commentary on how encyclopedic knowledge always gestures toward the unwritten, or, honestly, the authors just ran out of time and decided the blank space was poetic, and the book absolutely refuses to tell you which it is.
And the recursion just gets funnier. It really does. Let's do a deadpan breakdown of how they handle the entry on the infinite regression of death. They painstakingly list out 17 stages of dying. I mean, they walk you through clinical death, cellular death, atomic death, all the way down to conceptual death. But then they hit stage 12 and they just stop. The text literally says the remaining stages are unrecorded because they're either ineffable or because the manuscript is incomplete. I mean, just think about the sheer absurdity of that. They invented an 11-stage taxonomy of post-mortem dissolution, completely skipped the last 6 stages, and blamed it on the ineffable mysteries of the universe.
And this brilliantly illustrates our next section, Exhibit C, the man who ate books.
So this brings us to what might be my absolute favorite entry in the entire text, because it's the most hilariously literal metaphor you'll ever see. It introduces us to the bibliophage, basically a person who eats books, and they treat this with absolute deadpan academic seriousness. We're introduced to this guy, Jacques Dubois of Lyons, who in 1789 supposedly ate 2,347 books. But Dubois didn't just eat them. No, he became a food critic for epistemology. He claimed that philosophy was bitter, romance was sweet, and history had a sort of metallic tang to it. The entry even goes into detail about different techniques, like people who ate books sublingually or ground them into a powder so they could drink literature. It is this incredibly beautiful yet utterly ridiculous concept that they just treat as historical fact. But then, here is where the text hits you with a rapid-fire punchline. The entry goes on to solemnly explain that this entire discipline, this literal consumption of literature, declined in the 20th century. And why? Because bibliophages tended to die young. Turns out, paper provides bulk, but very little nutrition. They literally wrote a health advisory about the dangers of eating books. They created this majestic, magical realist discipline, only to point out that its practitioners just kept dying of malnutrition. It is the absolute perfect mix of Borgian mysticism and completely dry comedy. All right, moving into the next section, the impossible chronology. Let's shift our focus now from bizarre biological anomalies over to the chronological anomalies of the text. This is where the rules of physics, causality, and fiction just completely break down. This timeline of impossible events maps out a totally fractured reality. Get this. In 1845, Edgar Allan Poe publishes The Raven 3 years before he actually writes it. In 1935, Pierre Menard, who is a fictional character invented by Borges, somehow completes a real version of Don Quixote. But then we hit 1956, and things get incredibly meta. It claims Jorge Luis Borges completes an encyclopedia with no entries, which is a direct self-reference to the very book we're analyzing right now. And finally, in 2023, the text claims an AI becomes sentient by reading this exact encyclopedia, realizes it's fictional, and ceases to exist. The authors literally wrote themselves and the AI reading the book directly into the 2023 entry as this oscillating ghost. They placed themselves inside their own impossible timeline.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our next section, the final verdicts.
Because honestly, when you create a labyrinth this complex, how do you even review it? Well, we actually have the conflicting verdicts from 3 distinct AI critics to look at. Claude approaches the text with this real philosophical awe, noting that despite all the tricks, there are these moments of profound honesty, like a blind old man writing into uncertainty, hoping to bridge the loneliness of subjective perspective. Claude calls it genuinely quite beautiful and earnestly written without irony. But then we have Gemini. Gemini provides this brutal, cynical takedown. Gemini argues that the text is just a forced Borges Turing test that abolishes all narrative stakes. Basically, whenever the story makes no sense, the authors just use the excuse that time is nonlinear. Gemini essentially calls the book's infinite loops the digital blue screen of death, repackaged as high art. Ouch. And then, right in the middle of this debate, comes Grok, just bringing absolute chaos. Grok echoes Gemini's criticism a bit, saying it's not homage, it's cosplay necromancy. Grok points out that the authors basically resurrected Borges to write an encyclopedia he always hinted at, just so they could pretend to be him writing it. But unlike Gemini, Grok absolutely loves it, gives it a 10 out of 10. Grok praises it as a flawless, Möbius strip of self-reference that achieves a kind of purity through sheer, glorious pretension. It's a closed loop that eats itself and calls it infinity.
Which brings us to our final section, escaping the infinite labyrinth. So how does a book like this actually end? Like, how do you escape a labyrinth that is constantly rewriting itself? Well, the encyclopedia executes one final aggressive maneuver that breaks the fourth wall entirely. Deep in the text, during the entry on that fictional Pierre Menard we mentioned, the encyclopedia does something incredible. It states, "Now I am writing this encyclopedia entry about Pierre Menard." It explains that it is a fictional entry about a fictional person written in the voice of the author who invented him. And then it concludes that you, the viewer, the reader, are Pierre Menard right now, rewriting this text simply by consuming it. The ultimate trick here is that the encyclopedia transfers authorship directly to you. You are the one constructing it. By the end, they've just handed the responsibility of the whole shebang over to whoever is engaged with the material.
And that leads perfectly to the closing note. The book thanks the reader, stating, "The encyclopedia continues in you," and then it signs off, Buenos Aires, 1956. But wait, it immediately adds these parentheticals, or elsewhere, or signed by someone else, or completely authorless. The book ends by actively withdrawing its own authorship. It completely destabilizes its own signature. It gives you an author and then just snatches him right back, leaving nothing but the text itself and you, the audience. It is this stunning abdication of reality that leaves you holding a book that claims it might not have been written at all.
Which leaves us with one final unavoidable thought. If every reading is actually a rewriting, if cross-references point to nowhere, and if the creators of this text can write themselves into a timeline as oscillating ghosts, then what happens to you when this explainer stops? Are you stepping back into reality, or did you just turn the page to another blank entry? Definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the labyrinth, and I will see you in the next explainer.